Happy Monday and welcome to another beautiful week of life. It is finally spring, beautiful, warm air here in LA. And isn't everyone having fun with all of these tariffs? The world is ending with the stock market. Let's talk about all of that. So, hey everyone, it's good to see you. I hope you had a restful weekend and you got some time to disconnect from all the politics and the headlines and the emotional outrage and the drama and the Teslas being terrorized. And oh my God, don't we just need a break from it all? But we're not going to get one anytime soon. So the least we can do is come together and try to make sense of everything that's going on. So we got two things that we're going to talk about today. One is the tariff update, because that's obviously the biggest topic in the headlines. And to be honest with you, I'm a little bit tired of talking about it, but it's important that we're all at least developing some perspective on what's going on, because everyone's thinking about it, at least to some extent. The second thing that I'm actually more excited to talk about is the recent news by a biotech firm called Colossal that they resurrected a direwolf. The direwolf being a species of wolf that died out about 10,000 years ago and has been brought back, or remixed, we could say. And we're going to talk about that and what that means and some of the philosophical implications, because it's interesting. And on this show, I don't want to just talk about politics. I also want to talk about the stuff that's most interesting to me. Hopefully, it's interesting to you, and it's all going to be relevant to the human experience, even if it's just philosophical in nature. But first, we'll talk about the tariffs. So here's some of the broader trends and things that have happened since Friday. And as a reminder, last Wednesday, Trump announced a series of reciprocal tariffs that he's going to be imposing on other nations. And there's a variety of reasons for why he's putting forth these tariffs, but they're ultimately connected to the idea of making America wealthy again by bringing back American manufacturing jobs, raising revenue through tariffs, cutting income taxes below 150K, and protecting key domestic industries that are crucial to national security, like drone or semiconductor manufacturing. And regardless of what your opinion on this is and whether this is actually an effective way to do it, that's a stated plan. And if you're interested in hearing longer form thoughts on the zoomed out perspective, I encourage you to check out the video on my YouTube channel talking about exactly that. It details exactly what Trump's strategy is to help the average American, economically speaking. But here's what's been going on. First, we may have a trade war on our hands between us and China specifically. China responded to our tariffs by levying a 34% retaliatory tariff. And there's some threats from Canada mixed in with some interest in working together with us. And EU is doing something similar where they're saying that they are willing to go down to 0% tariffs, but they're also willing to retaliate against ours. And then we have Asian powers like Japan, South Korea banding together to avoid caving under these tariffs. And we have some smaller nations like Taiwan, Zimbabwe, Vietnam, leaning more toward concessions and lacking leverage. But let's talk about the overall market impact, because it's been a really strong reaction in the stock market in particular. So global markets tanked over the weekend. The US Dow dropped 2,000 points Friday. Asian markets hit decades lows on Monday, today. And the Europe FTSE 100 stock exchange fell by 4.4%. And people are starting to promulgate fears of a recession. And JP Morgan is now estimating a 60% chance of recession by the end of the year. So many of you are like me, and you're not actually like a super financial person. I don't follow the markets closely at all. So this begs the question. There's clearly a lot of disruption. There's clearly a lot of chaos going on right now. So why is Trump doing this? Well, if we zoom in, there's a famous quote from Warren Buffett, which says the stock market in the short term is a voting machine and in the long term is a weighing machine. And what that means is that essentially in the short term, the stock market reflects how people feel about the future. And it could be a response to a president's action or a potential war between two nations or a trade war. So it's a voting mechanism. It shows where people are emotionally. And then in the long term, it's a weighing mechanism, because once you filter out all the emotional short-term swings, it represents the actual strength of those markets. Some people have argued, however, that the stocks and equities markets have actually been overinflated for the last several years, because what has been happening is our government has just been printing more and more money. So some of you, probably most of you, actually didn't see. On his way out, Joe Biden said that he had one of the strongest economies ever. And it was actually crazy to read that. I was like, how is this guy saying he has one of the strongest economies ever? Like, this is after he got elected. And I thought to myself, okay, I guess if you just look at the stock market, well, it's just been going up higher and higher every year. So I guess if you look at purely that, it can create the appearance of the economy doing great. However, if there's more money in the market, the value of equities is going to go up. If you're printing $4-5 trillion and you're just dumping into the market, yeah, it's going to make it look like everything's more valuable because there's literally more money to go around. So part of the thesis of the Trump team has been, the stock market is not reflection of the average American's experience. And that's part of why many Americans voted against the Democrats and for Trump's vision for America, because they were like, well, equities might be doing better, but my life is not. Gas prices are up, groceries are up, real wages are not keeping up with the price of consumer goods. And ultimately, this comes back to a deeper thesis that Trump has had since his first term, which is that we want to help the blue-collar workers of America, the heartland of America, and actually stop focusing so much on the stock market, which not every American participates in a meaningful degree outside of maybe pensions and 401ks, but rather focus on the things that Americans tangibly feel in their day-to-day life, which for many Americans is not the vicissitudes of the stock price. So the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, makes his point in an interview that he just did with Tucker Carlson. I want you to check out this clip.
Are hoping that yesterday's move will lead to a demonstrably brighter future within 4 years. Is it your sincere prediction that within 4 years we'll say, actually, that kind of worked?
I believe that it's going to work. And I know that what we were doing wasn't working.
Yes.
So I think we have to try this. And I have a high confidence ratio it's going to work. And I have a very high confidence ratio. The good news is we have President Trump's previous term when everyone said none of this was going to work. Oh, yeah. The China tariffs are going to do this. They're going to cause inflation. They didn't. This is going to happen to working class. It's going to be bad for working class Americans. Well, guess what? Working class Americans, the hourly workers did better than supervisory workers. The bottom 50% of households, their net worth increased faster than the top 10% of households. And look, I'm not happy with what's going on in the market today, but the distribution of equities across households, the top 10% of Americans own 88% of equities, 88% of the stock market. The next 40% owns 12% of the stock market. The bottom 50 has debt. They have credit card bills. They rent their homes. They have auto loans, and we've got to give them some relief. That I was struck by the statistic from last year.
That's the message right there. Just as a bystander, I'm like, wow, okay.
So what did Scott just say? First, he pointed out that tariffs are not a new part of Trump's strategy. And in fact, Trump has been talking about wanting to impose more reciprocal tariffs or have zero tariffs both ways between us and other countries for about 40 years now. And there's old clips of him talking about this in the 80s and him saying that we're getting ripped off by other countries. And during his first term, he did impose tariffs specifically on China. Now, it wasn't as wide-ranging, right? He wasn't doing tariffs against the whole world, but he did it against China, and there are a lot of the same concerns expressed about the price of consumer goods going up. And what Scott Bessent is saying is that actually the net impact of that, he didn't say that exactly in this clip, but elsewhere in the interview, was the prices of goods going up about 0.7%, all things told. So I'm not a financier or a macroeconomist, but the point here is don't zoom in so much on every single move, because what people are doing is they're incredibly overconfident about what the net impact of tariffs is going to be. and they're only looking at one part of the equation. They're not looking at all the other things that are going on in addition to the tariff tactic. For example, making energy cheaper or cutting regulations to make it more attractive to do business in America and easier to do business in America. But tariffs are the flashpoint because they're easiest to understand in a vacuum, and it's a very simple metric that you can see, okay, China imposes this much on us, we impose this much on China. But what many people don't understand is that there are other non-tariff monetary barriers to America exporting goods to other countries. For example, something that I mentioned in previous episodes of the show is that Canada has very high tariffs on dairy and eggs and other products that our farmers make in America. Now, those tariffs only apply when a certain quota is hit. We have a deal called the USMCA between us and Canada and us and Mexico. You could think of USMCA as the replacement for NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And under USMCA, under a certain quota, we have 0% tariffs between us and Canada. And once that quota is hit, let's say 100,000 units of dairy, for example, after that quota is hit, Canada will put, for example, 250% tariff on dairy to us, and we don't have nearly as big of a tariff on them. But some people have argued, well, the quota is rarely ever hit anyway. It's only 5% of the time that they hit the tariff, the quota rather, and that's true. However, there's a second question here, which is, why do we only hit the quota 5% of the time? Well, in Canada's case and China's case and Europe's case and in the case of many other nations, they have non-tariff, non-monetary barriers to us exporting goods to their countries. And I want you to hear Trump talk about this and elucidate on this, because this is one of those points that's not easy to capture on just a chart, but it's something that you see if you're actually in the business of imports and exports. So listen to this. Actually, we're going to have trouble with this clip. So suffice it to say, this is an example that Trump actually gave today. Right now, he has a press conference going on with Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel. And a reporter asked him a question about tariffs. And he remarked that, I don't know how true this is, but even for the sake of example, you might have an auto regulation in EU around safety. And in EU, what they might do to an American car is drop a wrecking ball from like 50 feet up in the sky, and you drop it on the car, and of course it damages the car. But as a result, they say, oh, well, that's a reason you can't sell American cars here, or you can't sell as many cars here. And that's one example of many non-monetary, non-tariff related barriers that get in the way of actual free trade between us and other countries. Or, for example, we have countries trying to skirt around tariffs by doing things like China shipping goods through Vietnam, even though it's through a Chinese company. So some of these tariffs are to match the tariffs that other countries put on us. Some of the tariffs are just to retaliate against non-monetary barriers that are harder for the American consumer to see. And some of it is just to raise revenue, because it seems that the Trump administration genuinely believes in the tariff strategy as a way of financing America's and reducing the deficit that we have running up of nearly $2 trillion a year. So let's talk about some of the specific actions that countries have taken in response to this, because I think it's indicative of some of the second order consequences of these tariffs. The European Union has offered a 0-for-0 tariff deal on industrial goods exported to the US as part of negotiations to avoid a trade war. And simultaneously, they're preparing countermeasures if tasks and talks fail. So, for example, a levy package that targets U.S. exports like steel and bourbon, and starting that in mid-April. So basically what that means is, hey, they said that they're open to having 0% tariffs, which I imagine would be the ideal situation, although it's not clear to me whether the Trump administration is actually willing to go down to 0%, since part of their plan is to fund U.S. revenue through tariffs. But the EU is indicating, hey, there's at least an openness to going down to 0%. So the way to interpret this is a negotiation has begun. And I think there's pros and cons to tariffs, right? Like one people point out the obvious, which is that the tariffs are essentially a tax on American consumers, all other things being equal. However, what's not being acknowledged as much is now nations are actually coming to the table and engaging in negotiations over tariffs. And since the 1960s, we have had some of the lowest tariff rates in the world. Okay, we've had some of the lowest tariff rates in the world. That's an objective fact. And no one was really trying to address that. No one was trying to measure and level out the playing field. So at least now we're having a conversation about it. Vietnam has agreed to 0% tariffs on American products, and it has heavy reliance on US trade. We imposed a 46% tariff on its goods, so Vietnam came to the table and said, okay, yeah, we want 0% tariff. So let's work that out. Taiwan similarly offered 0 tariffs, and it's trying to protect its semiconductor industry, which dominates 90% of advanced chip production. And they're trying to protect it from US retaliation because we are one of the biggest consumers of those semiconductors and those chips, because we are on the forefront of AI, and it's also used in military technology. And that was in response to us levying a 32% tariff on them. Canada, mixed messages. They said that they're open to removing retaliatory tariffs, and they want us to lift our own. And we've already imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian exports. China is more aggressive, more hostile. They had a 34% tariff imposed on us. Trump has said that if they don't lift theirs by mid-April, we are going to hit them with ever higher tariffs. And here it's important to look at what game is actually being played here and what leverage do the various parties have. So there's a lot of fear around China, I think justifiably so, rising as an economic and military power, and that's been happening for the last 30 years. And they do have significant leverage in negotiations. They've been shoring up their manufacturing, getting their automation on board, and they have the ability to output massive amounts of manufactured goods, and we've become more reliant on them over time. However, what a lot of people don't realize is the US actually has tremendous power as a consumer of the world's goods. The US is the biggest consumer of the world's products. Americans spend more money on foreign products than any other nation. About $20 trillion. That's the size of our consumer pool. So that's a huge deal, because just like we're reliant on China for manufacturing, China is reliant on us for consumption of goods. So if all of a sudden we have a big tariff on Chinese goods and we're not buying Chinese goods, that's actually a big deal for China as well, because they are essentially this hybrid of a command economy and a capitalist structure, where it's capitalist to a degree, but they move their economy in one direction. For the last 30 years, they've been moving their economy intentionally in the direction of manufacturing. Now imagine you've put in, at this point, it's got to be hundreds of billions of dollars for sure, perhaps trillions of dollars invested in manufacturing and becoming the world's manufacturing base. If people stop buying your products, that's a big deal. So ultimately, if you'll recall in history, recent history, Trump and Chairman Xi Jinping seem to have a positive relationship. And I imagine that they're actually talking, that this is not just saber rattling with no direct line of communication. And although I certainly hope there's not a trade war that actually happens, because I don't think anyone really benefits in the trade war, this is the opening salvo of shots, and they matter. There's actually some substantial backing behind it, because the Chinese economy is very reliant on the US in a way that the US is also reliant on the Chinese economy. So let's look at the big picture and what's happening on the global scale beyond tariffs, and actually beyond even the economy more generally. I think what's going on is there's a larger move away from globalism and more toward nationalism. And that's the idea of America first. America first is inherently a nationalistic way of approaching governance. And for the last, since Clinton, pretty much, there's been a globalist agenda. And I know that's become almost like a curse word or a dirty word in certain more right-aligned circles, like the globalists, the evil, blood-sucking, satanic, pedophile globalists. Just like my Alex Jones impression. And that I'm not saying that's not true, just to be clear. But if we think of this just more clinically on a spectrum, just like there's left and right, Democrat versus Republican, there's globalist versus nationalist. And the globalist worldview is, hey, let's focus on free trade. Let's focus on no tariffs. Let's focus on being one big global community. We have free market ideals on a global stage. And that's the agenda that we've been running for the last several decades. And when Trump won and got elected, I think a large reason why he got elected is for many people in the American working class who are not living in New York or California, they felt like they were left behind because part of that globalism was, yes, by free market principles, China had a manufacturing and labor advantage. So a lot of manufacturing went to China. But for many working class Americans in the middle of America, they didn't feel like that actually benefited them. And they felt like, hey, maybe American corporations got richer and more successful, but the American worker did not. And I think that's part of why Trump was able to instinctually hone in on those people and rally that base. And I think the America First movement more generally is saying, hey, we've gone too far toward the direction of globalism. We need to move more toward nationalism and take care of Americans first, globalist needs second. So yeah, the markets don't like it because look at the markets. I mean, this idea of the Mag 7, right? So 7 of the most successful stock market charting companies. The Mag 7 and a lot of these global companies who do business in China and Vietnam, and they're domiciled in Ireland and they're all over the world. For them, a business doesn't inherently have an ideology usually besides grow. I mean, that's what businesses are meant to do. They're organisms that are profit oriented. I don't think that's inherently evil. It's just what the organization is meant to do. And they're going to do whatever is profit maximizing for them. The government's job is to set up rules such that the profit maximizing incentives of the corporation are aligned with the national incentives. Now, the rules of the game have been globalist rules. So a lot of these companies that do business abroad and their manufacturing bases abroad, and Apple making their iPhones in China and Vietnam, it's bad news for them in the short term. It's certainly bad news for them because, yeah, they've invested all of this capital into these supply chains that are not currently set up in the US. So of course the markets are going to not like this. But this isn't about short-term stock market swings. This is about bringing back American manufacturing, bringing back high-quality manufacturing jobs, bringing back industries that we are reliant on for national security, bringing back more of a consumption tax rather than income tax oriented economy and way of funding our government. And I also think it's fundamentally about American pride because look, I think most people don't actually know the ins and outs of economic intricacies, myself included. But I think what's resonating with a lot of people is this idea of, hey, look, these other countries are putting tariffs on us and we are not putting equivalent tariffs on them. And there's just a fundamental lack of sense of fairness underlying all of that. And a deeper sense that America has been getting screwed, and we've had policies and presidents and politicians who have been subscribing to globalism, and America has been second, and now we have a president who's putting things first for Americans. So we'll see how this shakes out. This is one of these things that I think we all need to be measuring in decades and years, not days. Because ultimately, look, there was stock market volatility and reactionaryism to what Trump did in his first term. Ironically, one of the things that he had most to his credit this election is the fact that he had a good economy in his first term. And I know some people will poo-poo that, hey, well, he inherited Obama's economy, and the only reason his economy was good was because he just didn't ruin it. And the reason he didn't ruin it is because he had people around him who restrained him, and now that he's unleashed, it'll be a lot worse. Possible, but what we can't deny is things were good economically under Trump. So my personal view here is this is one of these things where I just want to take the longer view. I'm personally already exhausted of hearing all these hot takes about tariffs, and all the terrors that they're going to wrought upon the American populace in the short term. And I think it's something that we need to not only wait and see, and I realize that's not very satisfying to people because people like to have a take immediately. Like no one ever went viral for saying, hey, let's be patient. But even if you can't resist the urge to short-term pontificate, at least let's look at the other moves that the Trump administration is trying to do in concert with this, like deregulating, like doing more drilling and unlocking cheap energy, like making it so that American industry is essentially but just more potent and more capable of being operated here, and focusing on AI and developing infrastructure and regulations that makes the path clear for basically a second industrial revolution through AI. And let's look at the whole big picture and understand that tariffs have upsides, they have downsides, and the question is, what is the net upside and what is the net downside? So those are some thoughts on tariffs. Those are the updates for now. In the meantime, before we move on to the next topic, which I think is going to be, frankly, way more fun to talk about, which is this whole Jurassic Park direwolf thing, I'm going to see if I have any questions from my subscribers. So if you're an Instagram subscriber or an X subscriber or a YouTube member, thank you as always for your support. I really appreciate all of you who are helping enable this new chapter of my life in this career, because it takes a lot of time to sort through the headlines and read multiple sides and try to digest this all into a nuanced perspective for y'all. So I appreciate all of you. We're actually going to be doing, for those of you on X, we're going to be the subscribers only space. I'll get back to you on when it's going to be. It's going to be either Tuesday this week or Thursday this week. We'll get to talk live about everything that's going on, rather than, this is cool, but you guys only hear from me. I don't really get to hear from you. And then in addition to that, for all of my subscribers and members, you can always ask me questions that I will answer on stream. The best way to get me questions is on X. There's a sub tab if you go to my profile, and you could just reply to one of the threads that I've posted saying, hey, ask questions here, and I'll respond to you there. If I see you in the chat, I will also respond there, but there's a lot of subscribers and I don't know who everyone is by name, but sometimes I see you and I recognize you and I'll answer your question. And also honor system. I mean, if you're a subscriber, just can say that if I'm missing your question in the chat. And then for YouTube members, it's the same. I post in the community section a post. And then for Instagram, if you're a subscriber, just go ahead and DM me your question and I will get to it and answer any questions that you got to. So let's see what some of you are asking. So Rachel says we need to get from under China. Yeah, and look, ultimately, I don't think globalism is bad. It's just a matter of having a right balance of globalism versus nationalism. You don't want to go too far in either direction, right? So you don't want to have this completely nationalist economic system where no one is engaging with trade and we're not utilizing any of the competitive advantages, because there are genuinely other things that other nations are better at than the US, and we want to be taking advantage of that. We can't make everything in America. However, we've probably swung too far in the direction of very little being made in America and defaulting to made in China. And not only is that creating an economic dependency, it's a military dependency too, because 80% of the drones that we import come from China. And drones are quickly becoming the standard of modern warfare. Or most of our pharmaceutical ingredients come from China, so we're reliant on them for medicine. And that's even scarier in a situation like war, when you need tons of painkillers and antibiotics. And you can't just spin that industry up overnight. You need time to develop that. So we don't want to be too far in either direction. And right now, the thesis is that we've gone too far in the direction of globalism, and we need more nationalism. Doesn't need to mean that we go more in the direction of nationalism net. Right? So if you think of this on a scale of nationalism to globalism, maybe it's smack dab in the middle, and maybe it's even 10%, 20% in the globalist direction. But the hypothesis is that we're maybe 30% or 40%, and we need to correct for that. So that's the idea here. But I think my biggest piece of feedback and guidance to everyone is don't get caught up in the headlines, because honestly, I think for most people, one of the things that Scott Bessent said is that, hey, the majority of Americans, they're not highly invested in the stock market. The bottom 50% of the country has less percent less than 1% of a stock market wealth. So think about that. Now, I'm not saying that the bottom half of the country has only 1% of its wealth in the stock market. I'm saying the bottom 50% of the country has less than 1% of the total wealth in the stock market. So this is something that disproportionately affects people who are higher up on socioeconomic bracket. And the stock market has been very well served. And if Trump's team is successful, they will continue to be well served. But it's about moving the balance and dialing things a little bit less Wall Street favored and a little bit more Main Street favored. So great comment. See, Emma says, it's crazy about our pharmaceuticals. We don't even produce our own antibiotics. Yeah, I mean, there's so much that we don't make in America, and it didn't used to be the case. China entered the World Trade Organization in, I believe it was 2001. And since then, there's been really rapid globalization and really rapid movement of our manufacturing abroad. And maybe that wasn't as big of a deal when China wasn't a military and economic power to rival America, but it is now. And a statement that China made a few months ago when Trump originally started saber rattling about tariffs is they're responding to that prospect of trade war, but they said China is ready for any kind of war. Kind of scary, also kind of like, that goes kind of hard. It's kind of a flex to say we're ready for any kind of war, but it's true, right? They're our rival in a way that they weren't before, and I don't think American foreign and economic policy has necessarily caught up with that. So we're playing catch up on that. Jimeno or Jimeno, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it's glad someone is talking about the stock market stuff. Yeah, and look, I just want to be clear. I know where I am an expert and I am not. I am not here to prognosticate on whether this strategy by Trump is going to work. I don't think many people are equipped to. I think even experts is extremely hard to prognosticate. I'm just trying to help you understand what the plan even is, because I think the majority of the news and media has been about how horrible this is and about how the stock market's crashing. And I don't think there's been as much focus on, okay, well, where are they trying to take the ship while we're in these choppy waters? And ultimately, Trump is a disruptor. There was always going to be disruptive times. Now, I think it's a fair criticism to say, hey, they could have been more graceful with the messaging. I think that's basically the Trump administration's greatest weakness. I think their messaging can be a lot better. But in this case, I'm not actually sure what the messaging needed to be that it wasn't, because we've known since he was campaigning that he wanted to do tariffs. He's been saying consistently, I'm going to do tariffs. They're going to be sweeping tariffs. We got to correct the tariffs. He said we're going to have reciprocal tariffs. And then Wednesday, he did it. So it's not actually clear to me what people wanted him to do that he didn't do. And I think maybe some more nuance for the American corporations on, okay, how long can people expect these tariffs? Are they going to be permanent? Are they going to be levied against every industry? Are they going to be carve-outs for certain industries? Maybe some more nuanced messaging there could have been useful, but no one should be surprised that tariffs are happening. And in fact, here's where I put on my little stock market guru hat that I definitely don't have. Maybe you could have actually expected the stock market to crash because you would have expected that, hey, they're going to put in place tariffs and people are going to react negatively to that. So it's not a big surprise here. I think it's just people don't like uncertainty, and the stock market's indicative of that. And there's certainly a lot of uncertainty. But ultimately, if you want big change and you want long-term gain, there does need to be a degree of short-term pain. But I think it's fair to say, hey, maybe the short-term pain could have been mitigated to at least some degree because people feel like there's been mixed messaging about what these tariffs are actually supposed to accomplish. And I will say, as someone who did make a video detailing the overall Trump strategy, I had to sit through 3 hours of podcasts and listen to the Treasury Secretary and the Commerce Secretary and Trump. It's like very few people, like less than 0.1% of the population is going to go through all these different podcasts, let alone compile it all. So I think it's fair to say that in this decentralized information environment, the Trump administration and Trump specifically could do a better job of just doing like a State of the Union style address where it's like, here's the whole plan. Watch this 30-minute video. You will hear everything that I'm trying to do. You might not like it, but at least you know. But overall, for people who have been following this stuff closely, which I think many people in the markets have been, it's been pretty clear. Lizzie Liz says, I'm in the stock market volatility. I am slipping a lot of my words today, guys. Sorry. I am in the stock market. Volatility is oh my God, this word. Mind-boggling. Apparently my mind is boggled. Trump is definitely disruptive, fascinating times. Yep, no one can disagree with that, Lizzie. And good to see you here. Dilo says asset prices were already wildly inflated. Volatility has little to do with tariffs. Yeah, I mean, there has been a thesis also that some people have actually gone as far as to say that we've actually been in a recession. It's just been masked by all this money printing, and what we're seeing is actually a correction from an artificially inflated stock market. Now, I would say that in the short term, the tariffs have definitely caused a lot of emotional volatility in the market. But one could also say that it's kind of like Scott Besson actually gave this analogy. The stock market's kind of been like a bodybuilder on steroids. Outside, it looks, wow, this person's so healthy, and look at those bulging muscles. But on the inside, their hormones are out of whack and their organs are straining to sustain this unnatural body that has not actually been built in a natural way. And that's been going on for a long time. Hence my comment about Biden saying toward the end of his presidency that I'm leaving you with the strongest economy ever. I mean, I guess if you look at the stock market with no other metrics around it, but yeah, a lot of metrics have been inflated. And that's why many Americans were like, yeah, if I look at the price of my groceries and the price of my gas, no, the economy is not the best it's ever been. And this vanity metric of the stock market is not going to convince them otherwise. So I will also say, to close this out, you know, it's interesting because it feels like we keep on moving the goalpost on what success looks like economically for Trump. Because originally, when he got into office, immediately the Democrats were talking about egg prices and, oh my God, it's been 48 hours since Trump was inaugurated and egg prices have still not gone down under Trump. He's been lying. You notice no one's ever talking about egg prices anymore? Yeah, it's because egg prices are lower than they were when he entered office. You notice how no one's complaining about gas prices? Yeah, it's because gas and oil have been going down. So by a lot of the metrics that actually affect people's lives on the short term on a day-to-day basis, things are actually getting better. And there is a risk that we enter a recession, by the way. There's a risk that we overdo it on the tariffs. And I think you'll get this if you watch my video on what they detailed the overall economic plan to be. They're very well aware of that. And the idea is to have a smooth enough landing that we don't enter a recession. But in the long term, we got a nearly $37 trillion debt. We got $1.2 trillion interest payments on that debt a year. We got a $2 trillion deficit. If we don't get that stuff in hand, the US is being projected to go into bankruptcy by 2037. And possibly before then, we go into some sort of inflationary debt spiral. And at that point, we can enter a Great Depression, like way worse than a recession. So there does need to be some short-term pain to avoid the long-term pain. And on a personal level, I'm just glad that there's a president with the balls to just do that, just do what's needed. And you don't get a lot of credit for avoiding hypotheticals. You don't get a lot of credit for the wars that you never started. You don't get a lot of credit for the depressions that you never allowed to happen. So I think some patience and some focus on the bigger picture would be great today. Okay. Oh, Dr. DSW says, let's see some likes. I appreciate that. Yeah, like the stream. I don't even know what liking the stream is, but I know I like seeing likes. So please drop a like if you like what I'm saying. All right. So we're going to drink some water, and then we're going to get to the next topic, which is Jurassic Park. It's going to be a fun one. Oh, delicious. You know, I wonder how is it that I watch, like, you know, I see like Ben Shapiro or Candace Owens or one of these talking heads. They'll just go for an hour straight. And I never see them drink water. And I wonder, how are you not drinking water the whole time? Or maybe they have some production magic where it looks like they're streaming live, but the producer's like a few minutes ahead and they just cut out the parts where they drink water. You guys ever wonder about that? Maybe I'm not hydrating enough before I get on camera, and they are. I don't know. We'll figure that out one day. Okay, cool. This is really interesting. A biotech firm called Colossal just use a gene editing technology called CRISPR on gray wolves to essentially resurrect and remix the direwolf. Now, direwolves are not something that are just from Game of Thrones. They are a real species of wolf that went extinct about 10,000 years ago. And Colossal just announced that they have birthed new direwolves. Now, before we get into this, to be a little bit more precise, they haven't actually resurrected the direwolf. What they did is they used CRISPR gene editing technology to edit key parts of a gray wolf genome to resemble key parts of a direwolf genome that make the gray wolves express direwolf-like traits. So their fur looks different, their anatomy looks different, but still, it's cool. Can we just have fun with this for a moment? Because I know people have concerns about playing God. I know people have concerns about the philosophical implications of this, but this is super, super cool. And we're going to talk about this. I'm also going to show you pictures of it. So here's what happened. Colossal used gene editing technology to resurrect the direwolf. And they created 3 pups that express direwolf traits called Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi. Now, Khaleesi you might recognize from Game of Thrones fame. She was one of the main characters in Game of Thrones, and this is a shout out to that. Romulus and Remus were the mythological or actual, for all we know, founders of Rome, and the 2 twin direwolves are named after them. Now, as I mentioned before, these are not exact direwolves. They're genetically modified gray wolves that are made to resemble them. So it's more like precision gene editing than a full resurrection. And 2 of the pups, this is fun, were placed on an iron throne. Now, how did that happen? One of Colossal's investors is Peter Jackson, the director of Lord of the Rings. After Game of Thrones ended, he bought the actual Iron Throne from Game of Thrones, and they did a photo shoot with 2 of the pups, Romulus and Remus, on the Iron Throne. And that's what got attention on this story, in addition to the fact that they literally just resurrected kind of a species from 10,000 years ago. So even though the pups were born weeks to months ago, the PR rollout is happening right now, and it's sparking a conversation about, hey, we have the power to now edit genes for animals. And very soon we'll have the power to edit genes for humans. Is this something that we should be doing? And this marks a milestone for the biotech and de-extinction space and taps into pop culture even, Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings references. We're going to talk about the serious philosophical implications, but let's just appreciate what this is and how cool it is, because not only did they remix the gray wolf as a direwolf, they named those direwolves after the founders of Rome and a main character from Game of Thrones. Peter Jackson is somehow involved as an investor in the project. He bought the Iron Throne, and they put the wolves on the throne. And the founder of Colossal, Ben Lam, talked about the whole founding story. So I want you to check this out.
This is so that's actually Romulus. We have 2 boys, Romulus and Remus, founders of Rome, and then we have Khaleesi, who's the new girl. So this is Romulus and Remus. So funny story about this. So Peter Jackson from Lord of the Rings,
Jamie.
Peter Jackson from Lord of the Rings was actually one of our investors, and he has this huge museum in Wellington that he's building for all these movie props. And he's like, I was sitting in Peter's house with he and his partner Fran, and I was like, I showed him the video of them howling. He started tearing up. And he goes, "This is the first time I've heard a direwolf, or anyone's heard a direwolf in 10,000 years." He physically, emotionally got chills and started crying. And then he's like, "Well, I do have the throne." I was like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "I bought the throne last week at auction, at a private auction for like Sotheby's or someone, right?" And so he did, and it just happened to be where the wolves were doing their vet checkup. Like, talk about cosmic coincidence. Incredible, right?
Isn't that cool? Like, isn't reality so funny sometimes? Like, I'm like giddy like a child over this, because this is just like, I didn't expect to be alive in a time when fantasy books became mainstream pop culture, and we would have directors of fantasy stories that became fantasy movies that had widespread popular and critical acclaim, was then funding biotech projects to resurrect extinct species. How cool is that, guys? And this is actually not the first animal that they've edited. I want to show you the woolly mouse that they created. And for a little bit of context here, Colossal, one of their ultimate goals is, or one of Colossal's main milestone goals is to actually resurrect the woolly mammoth. And on the road to resurrecting the woolly mammoth, they edited the genes of mice to have them express fur that's long like a woolly mammoth. Check out this picture. Like, isn't that cool and adorable? For those of you who maybe watched anime when you were a kid like I did, don't they kind of look like Super Saiyan mice? That's really cool. And yeah, these mice, they would not have that fur if not for the fact that using CRISPR technology, we can go in and directly edit certain parts of the genome sequence that are related to hair growth and hair length. So basically, they were able to isolate on the mice genome what they could specifically edit to have it still be a mouse, but have it express characteristics that you don't see in mice anywhere. So this is going to be huge for the bespoke custom pet industry in a few years. We'll see what goes with that. And someone said they might bring Elvis back. I don't know. When it gets to humans, that can get some weird territory, but we'll talk about that later. So in that case, they engineered mice to have thicker mammoth-like fur. And that's a small-scale test for traits that they plan to use in woolly mammoth projects. And these mice prove the ability to transfer ancient traits into modern genomes. And that validates the whole colossal thesis that we can essentially resurrect or de-extinct animals. But let's talk about why they're doing this. That's cool that they made a woolly mouse, and that's cool that they're resurrecting direwolves. But what's the actual point? How does this actually make life better for humans or maybe even animals? Well, their main goal is to restore extinct species and their ecological functions. They want to use genetic technologies to help modern conservation efforts, like boosting biodiversity or climate resilience. And the long-term aim is to rewild ecosystems using proxy species that can fill extinct roles. What I mean by that is there are certain species that go extinct that have various important roles in the ecosystems that they inhabited before. So for example, there's African elephants that in their migration across Africa, they actually distill the earth or they unsettle the earth, and that ends up spreading different plants, for example, or it can help with just breaking up the land so that other animals can benefit in their wake. And every animal has its own role of nature. So when an animal goes extinct, that can actually disrupt the local ecosystem. So in the woolly mammoth's case, woolly mammoths, when they existed, they helped maintain cold climate grasslands. And these were called the mammoth steppes. And they did that by toppling trees and keeping grasslands open, or churning soil and snow and insulating the permafrost, or spreading seeds and nutrients via dung, like African elephants do, or reintroducing mammoth-like elements could. Oh my God, this word is the hardest word. I'm just gonna keep on rolling. You guys know what I'm talking about when I say elements. I'm talking about elephants. But what they could do is slow permafrost melt, or they could reflect more sunlight through the albedo effects, or lock in greenhouse gases and fight climate change. So that's interesting, right? Somehow we went from resurrecting direwolves to fighting climate change by bringing more animals back into the ecosystem. And here's a real world example of a species being conserved and that helping in a local environment. So in 1995, gray wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park after being eradicated for decades in that area. And the effect was really dramatic and transformative. there was a trophic cascade that reshaped the entire ecosystem. And at the time, elk populations were actually running rampant. So elk populations were running unchecked. They were overgrazing key areas because there was no apex predator to keep them in check. And once the wolves were reintroduced, elk behavior changed. And the elk actually started to avoid open valleys because that's where they were vulnerable, as well as riverbanks. And what this caused was a recovery in vegetation, like willows and aspens. And that helped beavers return and build dams. It helped boost bird populations. And it even changed the flow of the rivers by stabilizing the riverbanks and reducing erosion, because elk constantly being around those riverbanks literally changes the contours of those rivers. So the lesson there is that if you thoughtfully reintroduce a single apex predator, you can rebalance an entire ecosystem. But here's where we get to some of the concerns and some of the criticisms of what Colossal is doing. First, there's some ethical concerns because there are risks to the animals that are being edited. There's risk to the surrogate animals that are going to give birth to direwolves. There's risk to the offspring if you make a mistake during the gene editing process. So we don't really know what this is going to do for the long-term welfare of the modified animals. And until we understand that, we don't really know, like, are we actually hurting some of these animals, or are we doing psychopathic experiments that are actually going to result in a lot of animal pain? Now, Colossal has responded to this by providing really nice reservations, and they actually hide the area where these direwolves are staying, so you can't just go gawk at them or disrupt their habitat. But there's also ecological concerns because, yes, they're trying to reintroduce species into ecosystems, but the problem with resurrecting extinct species is you're introducing species into ecosystems that they haven't been part of in a millennia. And that can cause a tremendous amount of chaos. And there's a finely tuned balance to nature that we don't really understand well. And then there are more technical scientific concerns because these aren't actually resurrected direwolves in this case, much like the woolly mammoths that we resurrect aren't actually going to be woolly mammoths. They're proxy species. And they're proxies in the sense that they might exhibit some of the same phenotypes, like maybe they have a shorter snout, or they're more heavier set, or they have bigger teeth than a direwolf. Or maybe these woolly mammoths are Asian or African elephants that were modified so that they actually grow hair and it's much longer and they have longer curved tusks, but it's not actually the exact same thing as a species that was extinct. And part of the reason why it's difficult to resurrect the exact same species is because sometimes we don't actually have the full genomic sequence of these long dead species, and we might have like 15% of the DNA. And based on what we know about other parts of the genomic sequence of these species, we will do a representation of some of the key traits, but it's not actually a one-to-one match. So for example, in the case of the gray wolf, they had 99.5% of their genome in common with the direwolf. And then there are conservation concerns too. And some of the conservation concerns are that critics are arguing that money should just be going to protecting endangered species now, species that are dying out, and not playing God with extinct species. And here's Colossal's response. And I want you to watch what the founder of Colossal says directly so you can see where his head is at, even if you disagree. Check this out.
The Red Wolf program came up. I don't know if you know anything about the Red Wolf, but it's kind of a disaster.
Yeah.
You know, it's the only endemic wolf to America. That's only endemic to America. It's a red wolf. It's beautiful, and there's like 15 left in the wild. With massive loss of genetic diversity, massive bottleneck. And I was like, wait, we're supposed to be this country of innovation. We can't save our own. When you think of like the American West, right? You think of wolves. You think of like eagle soaring. You think of like trout, bears catching trout. You think of bison. The thought that we could lose one of these amazing icons, like we're like, we have to do something about this. We have to figure something out.
So here's an interesting way to think about this. I don't think most people object to conservation of animal species. So if you think about the red wolf and there only being 15 left in particular habitat, I don't think many people would say, yeah, we should just let it die off or we shouldn't do something to try to bring them back. And we have seen examples of successful conservation efforts with species of endangered falcons and eagles and whales and wolves. But there's something philosophically different about bringing back an extinct species. And the further back it was extinct, the more different it feels from conservation efforts. But the argument that Colossal is making is, hey, we do the same thing. We're trying to conserve species that still exist. Why not try to bring back old species that used to exist in a certain environment and reintroduce them into that environment? And I think it's not just about the environment and the ecosystem. I think there's also just a genuine sense of curiosity about, can we actually do this? Because now that we have the technology, we can do things like create distinctly new species. Like that woolly mouse is not something that existed before. And one could argue it's not a species, but it's certainly a mouse with phenotypic expression that we're not used to seeing. So Colossal's overall thought on this is these technologies can benefit living species because we can actually develop tools for de-extinction that can help endangered animals by increasing genetic diversity or resilience in that species. So imagine a red wolf is dying out because we've deforested an environment or we've put toxins in the air that the red wolf is dying to. And now we can actually tweak the genome of the red wolf so that it's more resistant to man-made influences. Or they can do ecological restoration by rewilding ecosystems and bringing back keystone species. So one thing that's been talked about is the loss of keystone species like bees and saving the bees efforts. What if we could actually modify the genome of bees so that they can keep up with a rapidly changing environment that is being changed by human intervention? So the idea here is that some species are going extinct, not because of natural reasons, but because of man-made influence on natural environments. So what if we actually helped out those species? And Colossal will say about the animal welfare concerns that they do have protocols in place to minimize suffering and optimize outcomes. They're not just building Jurassic Park here. They're trying to build planetary repair tools through science. So let's get to the most fundamental concern, because all of that aside, let's say we actually were trying to recreate Jurassic Park here. I think a lot of people are just concerned that we're playing God. And here's CEO Ben Lam's response to that.
The Red Wolf program came up. I don't know if you know anything about the Red Wolf, but it's kind of a disaster.
Yeah.
You know, it's the only endemic wolf to America. It's only endemic to America. It's a red wolf. It's beautiful.
My question, if I was going to grill you, if I was a reporter, it'd be like, what right do you have to invade the natural process of my question, if I was going to grill you, if I was a reporter, it'd be like, what right do you have to invade the natural process of nature and to inject your curiosity and your ability to create new life?
I think that we've become the apex predator on this planet, and we inject our curiosity and choices every day that we overfish the ocean, we overhunt something. In the case of the thylacine, the Australian government put a bounty on its head and killed it off, right? And every time we cut down the rainforest, every time we drink hydrogenated water, we are, playing God on some level, right? Humans are very good at changing the natural flow of things. Now, the good news is that there's been a lot of work around ecology and understanding what the impacts to rewilding can be. And so it's been really, really helpful for us to understand, one of the most successful rewilding programs of all time was reintroducing of 14 or 15 wolves back into Yellowstone.
Right.
And looking at how the ecology of the system completely changed. Like, it changed the shape of rivers, because the elk population were just, they're getting fat, they were getting lazy, they weren't migrating. The sick and the old and the weak weren't getting killed off.
Right.
They were spreading disease. They were eating all of the willows and everything along the banks. So therefore the beavers went away. Beavers are like the most super, climate impact animals that probably exist, because they make wetlands, they make they cause the rivers and ponds to get deeper, so it allows different types of fish and different types of animals. So you have this thing called trophic downgrading, and you have this trophic cascading effect when you reintroduce these species.
That documentary is fascinating.
It's so fascinating.
How wolves change rivers.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear what you guys think of all this, because essentially what Ben is saying is that, hey, look, humans have been interfering with nature from the beginning. If you think about the modern dog, I have my little dog here, Uzi, my little direwolf. He is a domestic dog. He has been selected over thousands of years of evolution to be compatible with man. And how did we do that in the beginning? Well, we didn't have the level of precise technology where we could literally edit a genome directly. But what we would do is we would selectively choose to nurture the kinds of dogs that we would actually like, or at that time they were wolves. We would ostracize and sometimes just kill the wolves that we didn't like. And we would cultivate the modern dog. So is there a fundamental difference between us being selective about what species live versus die, what species we decide to make pets versus what we decide to make livestock, what species we decide are beneficial for our environment versus harmful to our environment versus gene editing? I don't have a question here. Rather, I don't have an answer here, but I think the question is at least worth considering, because many people are arguing that this is playing God, but one could argue that we've been playing God the whole time. And perhaps what it's like to be made in God's image, if you're Christian, is to have God-like impact over nature, because we are both of nature and happening to nature at the same time. So maybe this is the next level of that. Maybe us deciding what species live and die through our natural selection process is not that fundamentally different from us doing that in a lab versus in the wild. And there are obviously going to be mistakes made in this process. I don't think they're going to be as catastrophic as Jurassic Park. I mean, that would be scary, because I think the core message of the movie was don't tamper with nature. But that was a movie, and generally movies are going to depict the most negative outcomes, because those are the most likely outcomes to get box office sales. But I want us to also imagine a more positive version of Jurassic Park, where we could actually have kids go and experience real animals that used to walk the earth that are now back, even if it's just some sort of phenotypic remix of that. Or imagine bringing back animals that can help us regrow the Amazon rainforest or help with deforestation. Grow animals that are more resilient to the fact that we are rapidly accelerating the change of environments in areas where humans habitate. There's all sorts of interesting things that can happen here, and I think it's easy to focus on the negatives and the downside. I think it's very easy to focus on the downsides while not seeing the potential upsides and how this can actually be used harmoniously. So my general thesis with technology is neutral. The way that we use it is normative, though. And along with the fact that we've now developed the ability to do this, we have to ask the question, how should we use it? Because I actually think the right question is not whether we should make the technology, because I think curiosity demands that we're always going to be experimenting, and we're always going to see how we can use physics and chemistry and biology to do interesting things in the universe. And the question is, how can we do interesting things in a way that aligns with our self-interest? If we can figure out ways to do things in a way that aligns with our self-interest, then not only can we have interesting outcomes, but also self-interested outcomes that serve humanity and serve animals, because I love animals and I hope you do too. And I want me a dire wolf, as long as they can tweak the gene that makes it not eat me. So I hope you enjoyed watching that. And I'm curious to hear what you think about this, because philosophically, this is really interesting. And very soon, we're going to be getting into big topics like gene editing for humans, which feels fundamentally different, but technologically not too far from what Colossal has just accomplished. So who wants a woolly mouse or woolly mammoth? Can you imagine like getting like a miniature woolly mammoth? What animal would you, okay, so ignoring like the playing God thing, if this is going to happen, and you could have your own custom pet, or you could modify a pet to be whatever you want, what would you want? Would you want like a little dragon that you could fly? or a unicorn or a phoenix. Like, how cool would that be? Like, I'm gonna pull up this woolly mouse again, because this is just adorable. Like, how cool is that? How cool is that? See, Darth Grok says, I don't know if it's a he or a she, says he wants a Tasmanian tiger. That would be cool. Emma wants a dragon. I think dragon's really hard to beat. For me, it's close between like a dragon and one of those big, like, you know, the Narnia lion, like a big lion that's really intelligent and you could ride it around. Although I heard apparently they're going to be remaking Chronicles of Narnia and the lion's going to be a woman. So wokeism just ruins everything. But I guess you can make a super intelligent female lion and call it. Well, what was the lion's name in Narnia? I don't even remember. So yeah, what else do you guys want? What animals would you want to make? Rachel says, "Oh, yeah, that's the appropriate response. It's adorable. Come on." Gain knowledge, seek wisdom says you are really on top of the direwolf story. Yeah, I was gonna talk about tariffs, but I was like, I'm just burnt out talking about tariffs. How much new information is actually relevant to the average person? Let's also talk about interesting things going on in the culture. Eric says, I hope you go on more shows like Piers Morgan so you get more time in the limelight because your points are very nuanced. Thank you. It's very kind of you to say. You know, you're actually the second person to mention that to me in a few days. Someone said they think I'm going to be on Rogan by the end of the year, but I don't know. That would be cool. I don't even know what I would talk about, but I think we could have a really interesting, far-ranging conversation. I think what, you know, I'm curious, what do you guys get the most from listening to me? Because some of you have been watching consistently, so I'm curious why you listen to me. Because I'm not an expert, right? I'm just a person who's trying to make sense of the world. And I think maybe it's the clarity and the nuance and how I try to be fair to both sides. But yeah, I'm a generalist. I'm not an expert on these things. I just try to bring a deeper than surface level understanding of what we're talking about. I also want to show you guys a picture of Romulus and Remus here. Let's pull that up. And so you guys know, Romulus and Remus are the first two wolves that they birthed. And those wolves, they're weeks, maybe months old. And they're brothers, essentially. And Khaleesi is the youngest wolf. She's new, and she's a female. And they keep them apart. I don't know. I know if they're actually planning on breeding them. And if they were to breed them, I don't know what they would do. But let's show you these because it's kind of hard. I recommend that you actually go look a video to see what makes these wolves fundamentally different looking. Because if you're not familiar with wolves, they don't look that different. But some notable differences are the length of the fur is longer than you would expect a wolf to have. So check out these majestic creatures. Romulus and Remus, everyone. How cool is that? Are the brothers identical? I don't know. I do not know if they're identical, actually. Bob wants to bring back the Carolina parakeet. Okay, so some people want to bring back real stuff. I want to bring mythical animals. Let's just bring them all. You know, okay, imagine this. Imagine a zoo of just bioengineered animals. Like, oh man, that'd be so cool. Imagine a zoo where they're making like dragons and black flamingos and sharks that can walk. That'd be terrifying, actually. Like, that would be really cool. And, you know, just tweak it. So tweak whatever gene makes them not kill humans. Let's do that. And even just for entertainment, that would be really interesting, so long as the animals themselves have a good life. I think that would be a really interesting use of technology. And look, to the concern about, and some people have said, oh, it's a waste of money. Well, first of all, it's private people like Peter Jackson putting their money toward things that they either believe are going to make humanity better or make life more beautiful. It's like, I guess you could say making a fantasy movie is also a waste of money because how does it make people's lives better? But I don't think life is just about solving problems. Life is about enjoying life and having good life. And part of that is beautiful things, beautiful, interesting things. And if we just make our life solving problems, then we just solve problems until we die. That's not a very great life. So I'm all for, just like why go to Mars? I mean, I think there's plenty of great reasons to go to Mars from a Elon perspective of we need to maximize the chance that humanity doesn't die. But I think there's just something about the explorer, intrepid, curious spirit that we need to cultivate, because even in a utopic world where we didn't have any problems, a problem would be a lack of novelty and curiosity and exploration. So I think it's good that we have people with the means and with a passion to do this thing. There's always going to be issues, guys. There's always going to be issues. And you know what often happens too is we start something from curiosity and then we get utility. So we start off just wanting to figure out, hey, can we actually resurrect the woolly mammoth? Wouldn't that be cool? And frankly, I mean, they're saying it so that they can rewild woolly mammoths in the Arctic to, I don't know, add to the Arctic ecosystem. I'm skeptical. I wouldn't be surprised if some guy was just, he was high one day and he was like, bro, wouldn't it be cool to bring back the woolly mammoth? And someone else is like, yeah, okay, how do we make an investor pitch deck so we can do that? Like, I don't really care. I mean, honestly, some of the rationale sounds a little flimsy. If they really wanted to solve the environmental climate change problem, I think there's probably more direct ways to do it. I think it's just an interesting thing to try. And I think life is about trying interesting things, and it's inspiring. It's inspiring, and it sparks creativity, and it creates new ways of thinking and interacting with the world. So I think that's all really, really awesome. So I enjoy talking about that. Let me know if you like me talking about topics like this, because politics is important, but politics is there to support our lives, not be our lives. And I want to make sure that I'm also talking about interesting things that hopefully make you inspired and make you feel like the world is not dying because tariffs. There's a lot of good stuff going on in the world too. And actually, you know, there's this really good book. Well, I don't know if it's really good because I haven't read it, to be frank, but I like the premise of the book. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature. Better Angels of Our Nature, or Angels of Our Better Nature, by Steven Pinker. And it basically talks about how this is the best time to live ever. You know, in times of antiquity, 20 to 30% of males would be killed through violence, through tribes warring with each other and individuals getting into disputes. Life used to be exceptionally violent. Now, something like 0.01% of males die from homicide. So yeah, we turn on the news and we hear about the bombing in Gaza, which is horrible. We hear about Ukrainian and Russian soldiers dying, which is horrible. We hear about Hamas attacks, which is horrible. We hear about what's going on in Syria and then Yemen and all these people dying and bombings and violence. And it's like, it's enough to make you cry. That said, for the vast majority of people, if you did not have the internet, you would not be exposed to nearly as much violence as there used to be. Certainly not in your direct experience. The violence that you actually experience is observing violence online. So it's just a reminder that we don't necessarily have a crisis of existence. It's more of like a crisis of psychology and information. And that is a real crisis, because I do believe there's a lot of polarization and there's a lot of hostility toward one another, but the hostility largely is not physical. So just keep that in mind. As bad as things are presented to be, a lot of the time the way they're presented like that is because that gets your clicks and that gets your attention. And the best thing that you can do is be sovereign over your own emotions, be kind to one another, love one another, and do your best to just have a life that you enjoy while recognizing that everyone else is trying to do the same. So thanks everyone for watching. This has been fun. Probably going to actually make a packaged version of that conversation about the direwolves that you're going to be able to find on my YouTube. My YouTube is youtube.com/ it's a little @ symbol, That's Kaizen. Or if you just search for That's Kaizen on YouTube, you'll find my YouTube. And oftentimes I take extracts from these sessions and I package it together with all my references, everything, in case you want to share it with a friend. So guys, I will see you Wednesday, and have a beautiful week. Peace.